Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. I don't like to start this podcast by bumming people out. But if you're having a conversation about the state of journalism, it's bound to get a little depressing. So just bear with me here. Since 2008, more than 250 local news outlets have closed down in Canada. The US has lost a third of the newspapers they had in the mid-2000s. But this isn't just about failing business models. Only 31% of Americans say they trust the media. In Canada, that number is a little bit better, but only by a little and going down. And it's not just that people don't trust journalists. It's that they're now starting to place their trust in other, sometimes more dubious sources of information. TikTok influencers, Elon Musk's X feed, the Joe Rogan experience. The impact of this shift can be seen almost everywhere you look. 15% of Americans believe climate change is a hoax. 30% believe the 2020 election was stolen. 10% believe the earth is flat. You get the idea. A lot of this can be blamed on social media, which crippled journalism's business model and led to a flourishing of false information online. But not all of it. People like Rosen have spent the last decade arguing that journalists themselves are at least partly responsible for the strange post-truth moment we now find ourselves in. Rosen is a professor of journalism at NYU who's been studying, critiquing, and really shaping the press for nearly 40 years. He joined me live at the Attention Conference in Montreal to explain how we got to this place and where we might go from here. Because while technology has played a role in creating this problem, I wanted to try and understand how people may have exacerbated it. Rosen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So I rattled off some stats. I want to start with sort of the state of where we are in journalism right now. How would you describe the problem that journalism is facing?
Well, the problem is there's so many problems. The first is one you alluded to. There's been a loss of headcount in newsrooms. You had your statistic, I have mine. 20 years, newspaper newsrooms lost 77% of their staff.
Wow.
So that's important because what it means is journalism is just weaker than it was in a lot of ways. And the business model problem that created that situation has not been solved yet, even though here and there are newsrooms that are doing well, and there's the New York Times, which is an exception to every rule, and there are some new digital sites that are successful. Overall, journalism has been shrinking for many years. We're in like the 30th year, really, of the digital era, and digital journalism still isn't mastered. So that's one of the problems. Another problem has to do with the authority of the press and its attachment to things that are basically over. It's a very difficult business to change, partly because it has to produce the world every 24 hours, right? So
There's not time to think back, sit back and think about where they're going.
To stop the action and reset the company. So there are problems of self-definition, identity, mission that went unaddressed for a very long period of time, which weakened the press so that when the character waltzed onto the stage to ruin the press and American politics.
Who might you be speaking of?
The current president.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So here's what I mean. Journalists in the United States base their work, especially the political press, on a model of politics in which there were two major parties The two parties competed every 4 years. They did business in a similar way. They looked and acted the same, but they stood for different things. And that model of politics allowed journalists to stand in the center between the two
And equally
parties.
adjudicate them objectively.
Yes, and to do all sorts of balancing, which was really easy. And what happened when the Republican Party started to go off the rails into territory that we can legitimately say is anti-democratic, that created an asymmetry between the two parties. And that simple fact, the press took years to adjust to and still hasn't in many ways.
But is that so? A lot of recent histories of the collapse of journalism start with Trump in 2016. Should we start further back?
Yes,
or is that
we should start further back. Thank you for encapsulating what I was trying to say. These problems existed before he walked onto the stage. And that's another reason why journalism is weaker than it used to be.
What's savvy journalism, and how does that fit into that prehistory of Trump and the moment building up to Trump?
Okay, so the savvy style is something I got very interested in as a press critic, and I'm sure you're going to be able to recognize it when I describe it. It's a focus within political journalism on who's ahead, who are the winners, the losers, what are the strategies, who are the spin doctors, how effective are these tactics they've come up with, what about the political ads and what's the strategy here. And this kind of journalism, which appealed to many people in Washington and New York, in which you are trying to be smarter than everyone else about what's likely to happen. And it's very similar, as you might imagine, to sports journalism and what the game is going to be like. And it's really a sort of a game model of reporting. And I watched as some of the most talented people in the profession drifted into a kind of allegiance to this style for a variety of reasons, which were not very good reasons. For one thing, it's easy. It's portable. You can do it in any market. You can take it with you. It works for any election. You also create, and this is the most corrosive thing about the savvy style, is that it creates relationships between the spin doctors and the reporters and the people running the campaigns and the people on the staff. And pretty soon they all see themselves as kind of inhabiting and steering the same world.
I have a cousin who was the producer of This Week with George Stephanopoulos for many years. And
okay,
back when I was
example.
Like a political junkie and like worshipped the Sunday shows ages ago, I went and watched it live a few times. And that savvy style in the green room is really there. It just shocked me that like all these people who were just, I'm so used to see fighting all the time, were actually just kind of hanging out and they're close friends.
I've experienced exactly what you're saying. Yeah. You're not going to be on TV. You go into the green room and these people who allegedly are on opposite sides are just like kicking it. You know, they're sitting down having fun and, you know, they're just characters in a play that they keep reenacting. And I thought this was so much smaller than what journalism has to be.
So say more about that. So why is that a problem? So why is this sort of elite conversation around journalism?
Because it's disconnected from what's most important to people who are not political junkies.
Okay.
That's pretty clear, right? That's why.
Okay. What's The View from Nowhere?
The View from Nowhere is something that I just started talking about. This is my way to get published, is I just take things that make sense to me and I start using them online, whether people know what they are or not. And sometimes nobody knows I'm doing this and the thing just completely just falls away. And
I think that makes you an influencer.
I don't think of myself as an influencer. I think of myself as a writer who wins some and loses many, right? So The View from Nowhere is a couple of different things at the same time. It's a way that journalists advertise that they have no alliance to anyone else, right? That they're politically innocent. And it's also a statement that they don't have an ideology. We don't have a party. We just tell you how it is, so you should believe it because that's all we are, is observers of the world.
But wasn't the pretense that was what you needed to do to be objective?
Yes.
That if your view from somewhere, then you were subjective by definition.
Yeah, well, this is a way that they generated authority. This is a way that they proved to audiences that they were operating only in the interests of the truth. Okay. And that's good. I mean, you understand where they...
As a principle,
where they got that from. But the more it was obvious that the news did have a story to it, it did have maybe not a bias, but a leaning. People were smarter than that. And the new View from Nowhere also has this other element about it that I found fascinating, which is when journalists hear one thing, they record it, then they hear something that's very much the opposite of that. They record that. The Democrats said this, the Republicans said that. I don't know the truth. How do you expect me to do that, right? And that is the way that they present themselves as kind of politically innocent. So I didn't trust that way of doing journalism. And today, if people would ask me, should we continue with that model? I don't think so. I think it again was, to use a word of the day, weak.
There's definitely a feeling now that journalism has become too subjective.
Yes.
That we've swung the other way, right? That it's all personal or subjective or ideological or pick your subjectivity.
Right.
Is part of the solution, I know we're talking about solutions later, to move back to closer to nowhere?
Well, if there are problems with objectivity, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be solved by reams of subjectivity. That doesn't make sense to me. What I think would be better from both directions is, first of all, people who can, as journalists, tell us where they're coming from. Meaning not that they are biased, but they are acknowledging that they have values and interests and backgrounds and histories and commitments like everybody else, and they are going to be upfront about those things. This is one of the ways influencers become influencers online, is that they're not the view from nowhere. They're not the voice of God. They're going to tell you, here's how I look at the world. Now, it's important for them to also commit themselves to another thing, which is high standards of verification. Verification is the most important skill, and it's kind of the core of good journalism. Verification means, did that really happen? How do we know that's true? It means getting the documents. It means doing the interviews. It means finding the witnesses. It means actually looking at that report. All of these skills and routines are the heart and soul of real journalism. So when you combine the presentation of yourself, not as a robot, not as a god, not as a view from nowhere, but here's where I'm coming from, with high standards of truth-telling and evidence, and high standards of transparency, right? And you combine those 3 or 4 things, I think you have something much better than the view from nowhere, much better than objectivity, and there's a lot of good journalists online who are emerging who have a formula that's somewhat like that. So that's how I would replace the view from nowhere.
So to what degree does the view from nowhere, the savvy journalism, the elite journalism that emerged during that pre-Trump era, contribute to him, to his success initially in 2016?
Well, there are lots of different ways, but one of them is something I've called verification in reverse. So verification, as I said, is the heart and soul of real journalism, and the really good journalists are dedicated to that. That's what they're good at. They know how to take a possible story, and by gathering the evidence that they need, the verification, they distinguish themselves from all the other people who claim to be informing you. Verification in reverse is different. It's when you take something that has been verified and you introduce doubt about it. And the doubt creates commotion and confusion and noise and anger. And you can use that release of energy to power your political movement. And this is how Donald Trump skipped onto the scene in 2015 by doubting where the President of the United States was born.
There's no birth certificate. There's only a certificate of live birth, which is a totally different thing and a much, much lower standard. There are no hospital records. His own family doesn't know what hospital he was born in Hawaii.
And it didn't matter to him, of course, that journalists had already looked into it and verified that Obama was a citizen of the United States. And that's the point where he began to create this kind of momentum that really, in my opinion, started to launch his campaign.
And is that like the first signs of like the breaking of reality that we now seem to see so
that's
obvious?
What I'm trying to suggest. Yeah. And the really interesting thing about verification in reverse is that the better and deeper the proof, the more powerful is the denial. And to me, I don't think journalists have an answer to that because they're not going to exit from verification, right? And so to me, that was the beginning of this conflict, which is really in many ways more of a dismantling or a destruction of journalism than it was like winning an argument.
What should journalists have done in that moment, in that election? I mean, they're so critiqued for covering his rallies incessantly, for building up his
The only
audience.
thing that I can think of an answer to that is they should have been able to earlier on in this story admit to themselves and tell the public that this is different. This is not like something that we have seen. But the power of The View from Nowhere and what I said earlier, modeling your journalism on the this model of two sides got in the way of that. And it would have taken quite an act of imagination to see just how different and how dangerous Trump and the party that he was taking over were. But it was just too easy to go into it with the same tools that you use after every election, right? Let me just give you one more point on this. It took 4 or 5 years for the American press to routinely say that Trump was lying about something, using the term lying, which shouldn't take years because it's incredibly common, right?
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing about this? In 1976, Gerald Ford, who was the current president, was running for president against Jimmy Carter, and he said something odd during the campaign.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying?
Gerald Ford said that the Eastern European countries were not captives of the Soviet Union. They were still like sort of free animals. Very weird remark for a president to make at that point. And immediately people said, what? And it created a real problem for him. And later on, he explained that, what I meant was there was still the spirit of an independent, but he didn't say it like that. And so his staff, the press that was covering the election, all said that's like, this is weird. Where's he going with that? Why did he even say that? It's not even an issue. That's not what we're focusing on. Are you going to reverse yourself? Did you make a mistake?
Imagine if they did that for every time Trump said something crazy.
No, that's not nice. You interrupted my story before I
I'm sorry.
pulled the trigger on these people. This is outrageous.
Your whole build-up was coming to the crescendo.
Yeah, remind me not to do an interviews with you anymore. No. I'm just
Harsh.
Okay, let me continue. Okay, so that happens in 1976, right? And when Trump left the presidency the first time, the fact checker at the Washington Post said that he had 30,000 lies in his presidency. So that's what I mean by this is a different animal, right? And it shows us something else. The fact that everybody kind of got excited when Ford said something wrong and kind of like sprung into action tells us something about politics and journalism at that time. And what it tells us is very important, which is that the whole system depends not on constitutional factors, but on a kind of agreement that this is the way we do politics. There are rules, and both sides obey those rules, right? And it's like a little portrait of a lost world, because that's not the way it is now. And you can't use the same tools for journalism. And I think a lot of journalists sensed in this period that we're talking about the weakness of their tools, but they didn't know how to replace them. So they didn't replace them.
And then he won again.
Yeah.
After the election, Brian Stelter, the CNN reporter and kind of media critic for the CNN, did a journalism roundup, and someone on it said, it's hard not to see the Trump election as a national repudiation of what we do as journalists. Do you agree with that?
Yes, but it wasn't just a repudiation of what journalists do. It was a repudiation of what civil servants do. It was a repudiation of what experts in every sphere do. It was a repudiation of what academics do, what people in the intelligence community do. Everybody that made their living by having good knowledge, everybody who believed in verification, he ran against all of those people. He ran against the very authority of knowledge itself. And that's still happening.
How do you speak to the other side when they're in a different reality?
That's a hard question. That's a really hard question. And I don't know the answer. But the part of the answer is you get people together and you create conditions in which they can talk to each other.
And share a reality of some version of reality.
Well, they share a reality of what they're actually creating among themselves. Yeah. And then you have journalists there to watch it and observe it and learn from it.
You've written a lot about publics.
Yes.
Within our public sphere, within our journalism.
I did my dissertation, if I may interrupt for a second.
You may.
In 1986 about the idea of a press that informs the public. Where did that come from?
So is that what we need to create here? Is that we've lost a public?
Well, yes. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's become impossible to believe that there is a public. That's the way I would put it now. But here's a little bit more subtle way of discovering this. Nobody is worried that rich people, lobbyists, corporate executives, and affluent, powerful readers are going to have the journalism they need to do what they want to do. We're not worried about that. We're not worried that they won't have sources that appeal to them,
that they can pay for.
that they can pay for.
And,
yeah. We're not concerned with that group of people. The question before us is everybody else going to be able to have something like that for themselves? And right now, the answer is definitely not. You can't see that in the world that we inhabit now.
I mean, that's the thing that really worries me the most, is that not just different realities, but that real disparity between information spheres that people live in. And I just don't know how you get out of that.
Yeah.
And the implications of it in a democracy are so profound, and we're feeling it, and we're
Totally.
And so, what do we do?
But I
with
got
that?
something worse than that for you.
Awesome.
I grew up on the border of Canada and the U.S. I grew up in Buffalo. Canada was a great thing because we went to Canada to be on the beach and to get Chinese food.
Drink when you were 18?
Yeah. And, thank you for that reference, the view of the Niagara Falls was much better from the Canadian side than the American side. And on the night of my high school prom, I took my date to Niagara Falls. Where else are you going to go, right? I mean, that's what you do, right? Especially after they take the lights and they cut them out, because then it's a little darker, and this helps us, move
We get
along
the point. We get the point.
in our agenda. So where were we? Where are you?
You were going to tell me something worse than the collapse of democracy because of lack of shared realities.
I probably won't be able to get it through, but it's worth trying. One of the things that is so frustrating and makes this so difficult is that we end up, as we try to grapple with these problems, in this highly abstract vocabulary like post-truth and parallel realities, which do make a certain sense because they are describing a real thing, but they are hopelessly academic, philosophical, I would even say elite terms that have no chance of conveying what we're talking about, and they are more like, they're very hopeless terms that have no future because you've gone as far as you can in a way. Like post-truth.
There's no coming back from that.
Yeah, if there really is no more truth, then what are we doing here? You know what I mean? And yet there's a certain logic to them, because you get to that term post-truth by observing what's actually happening and how dramatic it is that people can live in such different worlds, right? And I don't know the answer to this, and you don't know the answer to this, and that's why when I woke up on the night after the election, I said, I'm taking 3 months off, and tonight I'm coming back. Not that I have any better answer
But that was going to be my follow. I mean, you just spent 3 months thinking about this, and
yes. Okay. So here's my feeling.
Okay,
is I'm coming back, but I want to find for myself a way of writing about this situation that we're talking about today that doesn't resemble anything that I wrote before. I don't want to keep saying what I've been saying for 40 years.
So we're going to wrap here soon, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about public media, because we're in the middle of a debate in this country about whether we should even have a public broadcaster. What is a public broadcaster in this moment that you're talking about? What would you say to Canadians who are thinking about either dismantling a public broadcaster or, more positively, are thinking about what it could be in this moment?
Well, I think it's really important to start with there's very good research evidence, in my view, that countries with a large public broadcaster sitting in the middle of the political polity and country do much better in avoiding this dissolution of democracy because they create some kind of common world of facts. And they're bigger than everyone else who wants to come along and play games. So I would say anybody with a public broadcaster that big and influential should feel very fortunate. And I think you're lucky, and you would be crazy to sell that out or to ditch it.
I mean, part of the challenge is that, as you've said, these are institutions.
Yes.
And institutions of the scale of public broadcasters are very difficult to turn around or to reform. And so in some ways
or to revive if you killed them.
I mean, that certainly is the case.
Yeah.
Well, that's certainly the case.
Yeah, they're very important. It's a great point about institutions, because this is one of the discoveries that we've made, a rueful discovery, which is, wow, you really need institutions to have a democracy. And nobody says they have to be there, but we really need them. And one of the problems the Democratic Party has now is that it has to defend the existence of all of these institutions, but then it sounds like it's just this old man, right?
And they're defending things that
longing
are also
for the institutions
in
of
many
his
ways flawed.
youth.
Well, and flawed institutions in many ways.
Yes,
right?
they're very flawed.
Yeah.
It's very flawed, but you're not going to fix the flaws by burning them down, right?
Is there Can journalism go away?
Well, first, before I answer that, I differentiate between journalism, which is a social practice, the media, which is the attention business, really. And it's important to see the journalism itself as a social practice which is reporting the news. And my own belief is that it will never die because it's necessary for people to live in the scale that modern citizens live within. And there will always be people, as you suggested, who want to take the risks and do it. And the media is a business that may or may not make it possible for journalism to be spread wide because they control attention.
Right.
But the craft of journalism will always be there because there's always going to be people who want to ask the question, did that really happen? Is that so? Is that true? And so I'm not worried about it disappearing, but I think we have to, in a way, discover again and again the means for supporting it.
Last question. It's easy to fall into some despair in these conversations about the state of democracy and the state of the information realities. And is journalism something we should look to as a solution to the problem of a failing democracy?
I think it has to be much, much more. I don't think journalism is the solution. There's so many things that have to be true for modern democracies to work. And all of these things are under attack. I'll give you a little example. In his famous book, which is called Public Opinion, Walter Lippmann made the point that you can't expect the press to be able to tell us what's going on if we don't have a government that also tells us what's going on. And with that argument, he created the whole world of Bureau of Labor Statistics says we're in a recession. Because his argument was without that kind of social science, we have no chance of knowing what we're actually doing, right? And right now, as we sit here, that public record is being destroyed deliberately by Trump and his minions in order to take us back in time where we didn't know anything about what we were doing, where we couldn't get our bearings because there weren't any numbers or descriptions to tell us where we are. And so the reason I'm going on about this is you need that too, right?
Yeah.
And good journalism. You need a society organized around the claim that we can know and still survive. And that is under threat because in his dinosaur brain, he knows that anything that connects what he's doing to reality has to go under.
I think that's a good place to end. Thanks.
Thank
Jerry.
you.
Thank you. Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. Our senior producer is Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The executive producer of Paradigms is James Millward. A special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you like the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really does help us get the show to as many people as possible.